A cool breeze whispered across the hillside, stirring the tall grass in slow, rhythmic waves. The fading light of the day bathed the rolling hills in a palette of deep oranges and purples, the setting sun casting long, jagged shadows over the camp. It was dusk, and with it came an overwhelming sense of tension. The camp's inhabitants moved silently, their conversations reduced to murmurs as they prepared for the night. They were a battle-hardened group, but tonight something different hung in the air, an unspoken fear that gripped every soul. Isaac Masser sat in his tent, staring vacantly at the flickering light of the campfire casting distorted shadows on the tent's fabric. The muted voices of his companions barely registered in his mind. They were discussing him. Of that he was certain. He could imagine their furrowed brows, the sidelong glances, the nervous gestures. They feared him, what he could become under the full moon. He hadn't expected the moon to rise so soon. He hadn't felt the usual sense of anticipation creeping up on him in the days prior, and yet now it was almost upon him. He could feel it in the air, a pulsing energy that grew stronger with every passing second. His gaze dropped to the silver ring on his finger, its cool metal pressed against his skin, a reminder of the control it afforded him. The ring, enchanted long ago, allowed him to suppress the moon's influence, to hold back the transformation, but only for a while. It absorbed some of the energy, dampening the primal urge to shift, though it could not fully cage the beast that lived within him. It had only been a few days since he had last transformed, and yet it felt like a lifetime ago. The memory of it was still vivid in his mind, the wild howl that had torn from his throat, the overwhelming hunger that had surged through his body. The beast inside him stirred now, restless, clawing at the edge of his consciousness. It was always there, waiting, biding its time until the moon called it forth. Isaac closed his eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath, trying to center himself. There was no use fighting it. The transformation was inevitable, but he could prepare for it, control it as best he could. He moved about the small tent, packing away his cot and adjusting his gear with practiced motions. Outside, the campfire crackled, sending sparks spiraling upward into the twilight sky. The low murmur of voices drifted in from the camp, but Isaac paid them little attention. He knew what was coming. The fabric of the tent rustled as a soft breeze swept through, and then the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, approached. Instinctively, Isaac's muscles tensed as he recognized the familiar gait. They had made their decision. The tent flap lifted and a tall figure ducked inside. Beau Dubois, worn and wary, stood before him. His face was etched with the lines from countless battles and sleepless nights, but there was a kindness in his eyes, a loyalty that had never wavered. Beau had been with Isaac from the beginning, long before the others knew what Isaac was. Beau's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of their current predicament clear in his posture. Despite everything, his voice was gentle when he spoke. "It's time already," Isaac asked, his tone a mixture of resignation and fatigue. He already knew the answer, but speaking the words felt like acknowledging what was about to come. Beau gave a slow nod. "I spoke with them. They've agreed to let you stay." There was a pause, a flicker of hesitation in Beau's voice before he added, "I told them you can control it." Isaac couldn't help but give a small, sad smile. Control it? That was the hope. He could suppress the beast for a time and delay its emergence, but no one could truly control the primal force that roared to life under the full moon. Still, he appreciated Beau's faith in him, misplaced as it might be. "Thank you," Isaac said quietly, his voice sincere. "You've always been a good man, Beau." For a moment, silence settled between them, heavy and thick with unspoken thoughts. The fire outside crackled louder, the wind whistling softly through the campsite. The weight of the impending battle pressed down on both of them. "They know about the horde, don't they?" Isaac asked after a long pause, his mind shifting to the more immediate threat. "The one we spotted 2 mornings ago?" Beau's face darkened slightly, the worry lines deepening around his eyes. "I told them. The horde will reach us by tomorrow, maybe sooner. There's nowhere safe from them, Isaac. No more running." Isaac felt his jaw tighten, his hand instinctively gripping the silver ring on his finger. His eyes, once distant and thoughtful, hardened with resolve. The fight ahead would be brutal. The moon, the monsters, and the chaos, they were all converging at once. "Tell Porter," Isaac said, his voice firm and unwavering. "I'll stand with them. Whatever happens, I'll fight." Bo gave him a small, tired smile, a look that carried years of shared hardships and quiet understanding. "Get some rest, Isaac. Tomorrow will come, whether we're ready or not." The night felt heavy and dark. By the time the moon began its climb into the sky, the camp had transformed into a hive of tense, focused energy. The men moved about quietly, their faces grim, their movements precise as they sharpened their weapons, adjusted their armor, and readied themselves for what was sure to be a fight for survival. They had fought before, and had stood against monsters and beasts that once seemed the stuff of nightmares, but tonight felt different, final. There was a quiet understanding among them that some would not live to see the next dawn. Isaac emerged from his tent, fully aware of the weight of the moment. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if each step carried the burden of his transformation to come. His body felt tight, as though the beast within was already stretching its limbs, preparing for release. The full moon was rising higher now, its pale light spilling across the camp and casting long shadows over the landscape. He made his way to Porter, the de facto leader of their group. Porter stood near the fire. His eyes were distant, staring toward the mountains in the distance, where they all knew the horde of monsters would soon appear. Isaac stepped up beside him, his voice steady but laced with resignation. "Porter, I know we're new here, but you've helped us. I'll fight with you, even if this is the end." Porter turned to him, his expression hardened by countless battles he had survived. Yet behind the tough exterior was a spark of determination, a refusal to give in to despair. "We've come too far for this to be the end, Isaac." Isaac glanced toward the horizon, where the moon continued its ascent. The beast stirred more violently now, its presence unmistakable. He could feel the pull, the way his muscles tensed and his breath grew shallow. The silver ring on his finger felt cold, powerless to stop what was coming. "I hope you're right," Isaac murmured, his voice almost lost in the wind. "But we're about to find out." And then the first wave came. The ground trembled as monsters began pouring over the ridges of the mountains, their howls echoing across the valley like the cries of some dark, twisted nightmare. There were dozens, no, hundreds more than Isaac had ever seen before. The horde surged forward, a wave of claws and fangs, intent on devouring everything in their path. Porter's voice cut through the rising panic, his tone sharpening and commanding. "Brace yourselves!" Isaac's heart pounded in his chest, his muscles tightening as the familiar, terrifying sensation washed over him. The moon was now fully visible in the sky, casting its silver light directly upon him. The beast was awakening. His vision sharpened, his hearing amplified as every sound of the battlefield came into sharp focus. His skin began to prickle, his bones shifting and cracking as the transformation took hold. The silver ring could only do so much. It held back the flood for a moment, but the dam was breaking. He looked at Porter one last time, his eyes glowing faintly with the power of the change. "Tell your men, if things go south, head south." Before Porter could respond, Isaac let out a deep, guttural growl. His body began to twist and contort, muscles swelling, bones elongating. His clothes tore as thick, coarse fur sprouted from his skin. His face elongated into a snarling maw, and his hand morphed into razor-sharp claws. He was no longer Isaac. Standing before them was an 8-foot-tall werewolf, its eyes burning with a fierce, primal hunger. Isaac's human thoughts receded, replaced by the beast's instincts. The creature threw back its head and let out a thunderous howl that shook the ground beneath its feet. Porter's eyes widened in shock, but he didn't falter. Turning to his men, he raised his pickaxe high and shouted, "South, to Barrowbourne if the battle turns! Charge!" The men, bolstered by Porter's command and Isaac's transformation, surged forward with renewed vigor, their weapons raised high as they clashed with the oncoming horde. Isaac, now the werewolf, rushed into the fray, his claws tearing through the ranks of monsters with savage ferocity. He moved like a storm of teeth and claws, unstoppable and terrifying. The beast that Isaac had become was a force of nature, wild, brutal, and relentless. His powerful limbs slammed into the newest creatures, sending them flying through the air like ragdolls. Blood sprayed from his claws as he tore into flesh and bone, his growls mixing with the shrieks of the dying monsters. The enemy, once fierce and overwhelming, faltered as they faced the fury of Isaac's transformation. No longer were they simply fighting men with swords and shields. They were now facing something primal, something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. But despite his monstrous power, the werewolf was not mindless. Deep within, the human part of Isaac remained, focused and controlled, steering the beast's actions toward protecting the men who fought beside him. Porter, seeing the impact of Isaac's transformation, rallied his men. "Push forward," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the chaos of the battle. He slashed through an oncoming beast with a clean, practiced stroke, his face set with determination. The men, inspired by both their leader's courage and the terrifying strength of Isaac, fought harder. Their swords gleamed in the moonlight as they hacked and slashed at the monsters, holding the line against the onslaught. But for every monster they felled, two more seemed to take its place. The ground beneath them was quickly becoming slick with blood and viscera, and the air was thick with the scent of death. Isaac, through a whirlwind of destruction, could feel the tide turning. The horde was endless, an unyielding sea of fangs, claws, and fury. He roared as he slashed through another wave, but even as he fought, he knew the truth. They couldn't hold this position much longer. The moonlight illuminated the field, revealing the sheer scale of the enemy. The monsters, now realizing the power of the werewolf before them, began to encircle Isaac, sensing him as the biggest threat. They snarled and snapped, their yellow eyes gleaming with bloodlust. One of the larger beasts lunged at Isaac, a hulking creature with scaled skin and a massive maw full of jagged teeth. It slammed into Isaac, knocking him back with tremendous force. For a moment, Isaac struggled under the weight of the beast, its claws raking against his furred chest. With a powerful swipe of his claws, Isaac disemboweled the creature, throwing it aside with a roar of triumph. Yet the effort had cost him. He could feel the strain on his body. The toll the transformation took was immense, and he couldn't maintain this pace forever. The beast was strong, but it wasn't invincible. Porter, cutting down another monster, noticed Isaac beginning to slow. His brow furrowed with concern. "We need to fall back," he shouted to his men. "Regroup to the south." The order rippled through the ranks. The men, weary but alive, began to move back in formation, fighting defensively as they retreated toward the southern edge of the camp. Isaac, still in his werewolf form, snarled and slashed at any monster that tried to follow them, his blood-soaked fur gleaming in the moonlight. But the monsters pressed in, relentless. As the men pulled back, it became clear that they were being overwhelmed. The horde was too vast, too determined. They were being surrounded. Isaac, sensing the danger, let out another deep, guttural howl, a rallying cry to the men. His claws tore through another wave of enemies, but it was clear that even his might wouldn't be enough to stem the tide for much longer. Porter's voice rang out again, desperate but resolute. "Fall back, faster! Isaac, hold them off!" Isaac turned, his glowing eyes locking onto Porter for a brief moment. Even through the haze of his werewolf instincts, Isaac understood. He had to buy them time. He had to keep the monsters at bay long enough for the group to escape south. With a snarl, Isaac threw himself back into the fray. His massive frame tore through the monsters like a living weapon. Claws flashed in the moonlight as he ripped through the enemy lines, scattering them and sending beasts flying through the air in pieces. The ground quaked beneath him as he moved, a juggernaut of muscle and rage. But the enemy was vast, and Isaac was only one. The monsters, sensing an opportunity, began to swarm him in greater numbers. A particularly large creature, a towering tusked brute, charged Isaac, its thick arms swinging a massive club-like bone. Isaac dodged the first swing, but the second caught him in the side, sending him sprawling against the blood-soaked ground. He struggled to rise, his vision blurring for a moment. The pain was sharp, but the adrenaline and fury of the beast within kept him moving. With a growl, Isaac leaped to his feet, slashing at the brute's legs. The creature howled as it toppled over, its legs shredded by Isaac's claws. But more were coming. Isaac could see them closing in. Too many. Far too many. His breathing was ragged, his muscles burning with the effort of maintaining the fight. He could feel the transformation beginning to strain his body to its limits. Porter's voice echoed in the distance, ordering his men to retreat further. Isaac could barely hear him over the roars of the monsters and the pounding of his own heart. His vision narrowed as he focused on the horde in front of him. They were closing in fast. He let out one final howl, a sound that pierced the night and sent chills through both his allies and enemies. Then, with everything he had left, Isaac lunged at the nearest wave of monsters. His claws flashed and his teeth bared as he tore into the beasts with wild abandon. But for every monster he brought down, more came. The weight of them began to overwhelm him, claws and teeth tearing at his fur, his flesh. Isaac knew he couldn't hold them off much longer. His vision blurred again, this time with exhaustion. The silver ring on his finger, which had once been a source of control, now felt heavy and cold, powerless to stop the inevitable. Just as the horde began to close in, Isaac saw a flash of movement out of the corner of his eye. Porter and the remaining men had made it to the southern edge of the camp. They were retreating, heading towards safety. Isaac let out a final snarl, turning to face the horde one last time. He would hold them off for as long as he could, for as long as it took. The monsters descended on him, their numbers overwhelming, their claws digging into his flesh. Isaac roared in defiance, refusing to fall even as the darkness began to close in around him. His last thought before the world went back was simple. They had escaped.